So, welcome to another public conversation hosted by Springtide Research Institute. My name is John Vitek, and I'm the founder of Springtide. And I'm fortunate enough today to be hosting this panel of thinkers and practitioners who work with and care about young adults and their flourishing. So, let's meet our panel for this conversation. And Mike, would you like to begin with introducing yourself?
Thanks, John. Dr. Mike Mitchell, Vice President for Student Affairs and Dean of Students at the University of South Alabama. I am and have been here for about 15 years, but in the field for over 25. My pronouns are he, him, his. And I'm in the southern part of Alabama, close to the Gulf of Mexico, and right here in the southern part of the country. In my work as a vice president for student affairs, I work mainly with all of those out of the classroom experiences on a college campus. So residence life, food services, counseling and testing, multicultural affairs, just about everything that happens outside of the classroom. And in addition to that, over the 20 plus years that I've been in the field, I've had an opportunity to serve as an advisor for men's groups, one being my fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha. But also, I currently serve as the advisor for a Collegiate 100 chapter, which is associated with the 100 Black Men of America.
Wonderful. Thanks, Mike. And thanks for being with us. And Skitch?
Yeah, thank you for having me here. So I'm Skitch Matson. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I am coming from Princeton, New Jersey, just a little bit further away from from y'all. And I've been working with youth and young adults for about the past 15 years, whether that's been in youth ministry in churches or with youth in camping worlds or young adults who are leading youth in camping ministries. But then also most recently, I'm the Methodist chaplain at Princeton University and have been for about the past 7 years. So I've been working with youth and young adults for a span of time and a host of different things. I'm originally from California, but I will say I love this shift in New Jersey where conflict is something that is just openly talked about, whereas on the West Coast, oftentimes that can be pushed under. And I think that that's relevant for some of our conversation today.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Skitch. And Wesley?
Hi, John. Thank you for having me today. My name is Wesley Rowell, and my pronouns are he, him, his. I am also surprisingly in Princeton, New Jersey. I moved here 3 years ago after 24 years in New York City. And I came here for seminary at Princeton Seminary, and I graduated exactly a month ago today. So it was a mid-career change. And I will be working at Trinity Episcopal Church here in New Jersey, here in Princeton, and I will be the pastoral associate. And what I will do in that role is community engagement, like the prison ministry and things like that, social justice issues, but very specifically, I'm working with, I interned there for 2 years, and I will be working with the youth program there, which is very active and actually grew during the pandemic. So I'm looking forward to that work.
Wonderful. Great. Thank you, Wesley. And thank you to each of you. You bring a very rich and diverse background to this conversation today, which is really important. So again, I'm John, and I identify as he, him. I'm located in Rochester, Minnesota, and I'm honored to host this conversation where we will be exploring the ways in which young adults, both on college campuses and elsewhere, experience spaces of belonging and connection. And so many of us are aware of the epidemic levels of loneliness and isolation that is experienced by Gen Z generally. Yet today we want to give special attention to the ways that young men are navigating these realities. The Springtide team was inspired to host today's conversation after observing the first episode of season 7 of the Netflix show Queer Eye. And in that episode titled Queer Eye for the Lambda Chi, the host visits a college fraternity house in New Orleans. The show highlights how these fraternity brothers undergo a week of transformation with important lessons and significant conversations where they explore their inner and their outer lives. And what emerged were distinct themes that Springtide sees in our own qualitative and quantitative research with young people. And yet it gave us a pause to ask a certain question. That is, what's distinctive about the ways in which young men are experiencing loneliness, social isolation, connection, and community? So let's get into the conversation, beginning with the findings from a recent report from the US Surgeon General. And in that report that's titled, "Our Epidemic of Loneliness and Isolation, an advisory on the healing effects of social connection and community," the Surgeon General reports that approximately half of US adults report experiencing loneliness, with some of the highest rates among young adults. And the rate of loneliness among young adults has increased every year between 1976 and 2019. In other words, this rise in experience of loneliness is not something new, and yet it has been increasingly prevalent year over year. So Mike, let's begin with you. And I'm wondering if you can describe the ways in which you are seeing loneliness and isolation impact the young people you serve.
Well, John, I first began to really hear and talk about this concept of loneliness, particularly amongst college students, around 2017. A colleague of mine forwarded me an article that talked about the rate of loneliness amongst college students. And at that time, we had began to have conversations around engagement and the concept of belonging and how our programs could help students increase their sense of belonging on campus. 3 years later, the pandemic hits. And at the time that I saw that article, the things that were really, high on the agendas of students were, the contentious political environment in 2017. Many campuses were seeing this rash of controversial speakers come to their campuses and the myriad of issues that those items presented. It's been challenging for several years now for students to sometimes find work after they complete their college degrees. And then the pandemic hits, and all of those things are exacerbated. But then you also have the racial injustice of the summer of 2020 and the murder of George Floyd, and all of these things that are happening. And one of the ways that I think we have seen this particular issue represent itself is as a huge increase in the numbers of visits that are taking place at our University Counseling and Testing Center. So students are really having to use those resources in a way that they in the past have not really been so open to do and particularly open to talk about. But we are seeing those numbers at our counseling and testing centers really increase. And a lot of the students are talking about this sense of loneliness, that they have everything in the world in their hand, in their devices and through technology, but they are still experiencing this sense of loneliness. And oftentimes when they are even present, because of the presence of technology and social media, they oftentimes are not present when they are present, because they're engaged in technology and in their phones. And when that ends, they find themselves with this feeling of loneliness, I think.
Yeah, you raise a really important point. Oftentimes when we focus on this issue, loneliness, social isolation, so on, we focus on the individual and the effects on the individual or the experience of the individual. But you raise also the importance of understanding the social context, sociocultural factors that are impacting and driving this as well, huh? And I'm wondering, Skitch or Wesley, from your perspective, what are you seeing among the young people that you serve, and are you observing from your perspective, are there any particular social factors that you see driving this increase of loneliness and isolation?
It feels like to me that what the pandemic did was expose things that were already there. Like all of a sudden the Band-Aid was ripped off. And, I moved to Princeton in August of 2020 to begin seminary. And because I am older than most of the students here, my role here became kind of a paternal or big brother kind of role to these, they're babies to me, like 22, 23, 24-year-olds. And these are people who are going into the ministry mostly, and many of them had no tools to deal with the very thing they're going to face when they are in congregations, in congregational settings. So these there was an extraordinary amount of among my classmates of this like epidemic loneliness, and I think that the seminary, like a lot of places, is now playing catch up as far as how do we, and just because culturally, these are people who are going to be in ministry, we take care of it ourselves, we figure it out ourselves. And it's also a very kind of particularly male kind of thing as well. So you have these young men who have never been taught, never been socialized to express feelings. And, it's easy to say, okay, now let's tell us how you feel. And without any tools, without any facilitating of that. So I think what I felt is that institutions maybe we're not quite ready for what is hitting them right now in real time. And it feels like we're playing catch up.
Yeah. Skitch, anything from your perspective that you want to share?
Yeah, I'd agree with both of what's been said so far. And I remember having a conversation via Zoom during, middle of the pandemic with someone who was living just a few miles away. And she was talking about how she could tell already in the middle of the pandemic, maybe it was 2021, she was like, my ability to converse with people has just decreased. Like, I don't know how to socialize anymore. I'm going to have to relearn this skill. And that's for somebody who, at that point, she was in her mid-30s, getting her PhD. She knew how to socialize. She had a very strongly connected friend group. Even for her, she lost something and had to regain it. So especially when we're talking about people that may not have had this skill, as Wesley said, like this Band-Aid, this was a problem already that we just pulled the Band-Aid off and now we can expose it, we can see it. For people that don't have this skill, it's not a relearning, it's trying to learn it for the first time. And learning something for the first time is just always really, really difficult. So I think that that's something that was exposed, that yes, we're all playing catch up here. I'm playing catch up. Like, I don't want to sit in this conversation, I don't know about others, but it's not like I fully regained all of my social skills. I can still tell that like either I'm exhausted or I don't know what to do in certain situations. I'm wondering like, I'm still questioning myself in some situations, even now in 2023.
Yeah. So, we mentioned the recent episode of the Netflix show Queer Eye that was featuring a group of male fraternity brothers on a college campus. And the scene was that they were sitting around a fire and discussing with the show's cultural expert, Karamo Brown, their experiences of loneliness and isolation. And that gave us a glimpse into how young males uniquely are experiencing this phenomenon. And as you may know, Springtide's inaugural study was titled Belonging. This was our first study that we did in 2019, in which we examined the rise of loneliness among Gen Z. Again, something that has been emerging over a number of years, but reaching really epidemic levels in recent years. And we found that 39% of males ages 18 to 25 report feeling completely alone. 39% completely alone. And 52% of them felt like nobody understands me. I mean, these are really staggering numbers, right? And so, Skitch, just to continue with that, let me turn to you and ask, what do you see as distinctive about the experience of young male students with respect to loneliness and isolation?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a really sad question, but I'm grateful that you all are doing this research and highlighting it. As I've been sitting with some of the questions you all have been asking and rewatching that episode and thinking about other experiences with students here or students elsewhere, to me, I think one of the focal points specifically for young men is this question between expression and performance. They know how to do one really well, and they have no idea what to do with the other. You can even hear it in the episode, right? There are certain words. There's at one point, I mean, I know I don't want to jump on Wesley's toes for some of the upcoming questions, but at one point, as one of the characters starts to break down, after he breaks down and everyone kind of hugs him, he says, "I'll do better next time." Which to me was just like, and there it is again. Everything is based on performance, performance, performance. Because if I can perform this, oh, okay, well then now I'm good. That's the measure of goodness, which Karamo kind of is trying to focus in on, of like, what does it mean to be good? How do we understand what is good? There's this focus on performance. I have to do this in order to be good, which in a Brene Brown kind of framework, if people listening or others know Brene Brown, she talks about shame and guilt and the difference between shame and guilt. One is I have done something bad, and that's guilt, and shame is I am bad. And being able to distinguish, kind of pull something outside of oneself, I think that's a closer way of expression. It's digging in and not having full answers instead of focusing on saying that this is exactly what something is, instead of saying, I need to kind of, can you all just sit around and let me figure this out with you around? I don't know the right answer here, but can I just explore some of this space? Can I explore some of my internal self with you all around? Would that be okay? Is a very vulnerable thing to do. And Brene Brown, obviously, has a big focus on vulnerability. But I think that these are some of the things distinctly with young men is expression versus performance. And how do we make this shift towards giving space to try on expression? One of my mentors, actually, from seminary where Wesley and I went, she would say, in class, she would make you stand up and go to either end of the class. And, it was like, what do you think, A or B? And everyone knew it was somewhere in the middle, but she was like, no, you got to go to either end. You got to try it on like a pair of pants. Maybe don't buy it at the end of class, but you got to at least try it on. And there was just this space that she created for us to try something on, knowing that we didn't have to hold on to it at the end. And I think with performance-based, you have to hold on to it and say, nope, I chose good, I chose correctly, and everyone knows this is right. Whereas expression is, I'm going to choose this right now. And maybe tomorrow I choose differently. But right now I'm going to choose this. And I think having that openness, allowing for more of that openness, specifically with young people, is something that is needed.
Yeah, I love that. Like, it's in that episode, the way you frame that is, I hadn't thought about it that way before, but in one sense, they were trying on vulnerability. And for some of them, maybe for the first time, right? So I want to circle back to something we began touching on a little bit earlier. And Wesley, I'm going to come to you on this, and thinking about particular personal or social barriers that you see impede young men in their ability to generate a greater sense of connection or community. Like, this performance, this idea, right, of performance expression. But what are the barriers? What is preventing young men or maybe that's not even the right question, but the barriers to that ability to really enter into a vulnerable place, particularly with other young men or with other people of the same gender. And I'm thinking, for example, in the episode, there was one young man who talks about his experience of loneliness and how he keeps it to himself. I believe he said, you don't say nothing till somebody asks about it. So he talks about how he's been conditioned to just keep it all inside, right? And then another young man who stated, I don't want to bring it up. I get anxiety about bringing it up. I don't even know what I'm feeling half the time. So there's all of this going on. But so Wesley, come back to you and explore a little bit these personal or social barriers that you observe that are an impediment for young men in particular to enter this kind of vulnerable space.
That's such a good question. And, a thing that really struck me about the episode was when Karamo pricked the surface, how it just came flooding out. I think there was one young man who said, he said, I've never cried before. And it was instant and it was tears. And, I think, culturally, the space that men and young men are allowed to be in don't allow that. I was thinking, I grew up in North Carolina. I grew up going to the barbershop, and the Black barbershop is a cultural institution. But what's interesting is, I remember those conversations when I was a kid, and 10 and 12, and the men sitting around talking about women, but not talking ever about feelings. And then, growing up as this queer kid, like it just made me shut down more and more and more and more and more. I'm like, this is not a safe space for me. And I think what happens is that, you have these spaces like, watching sports or doing all these things, but there's it just never cracks the surface. It seems impossible to crack the surface. And I think about, Richard Rohr talks about there not being any rites of manhood anymore. Outside of probably like bar mitzvahs, there's not this like rite of passage anymore for young men. So men my father's age or men my age don't know how to help young men go through that rite of passage. So, it's like this, it's a form of intergenerational trauma, I think, that we just keep passing it down. And, I thought it was, I noticed some of my own biases coming up watching the episode, because the minute I heard, oh, it's frat guys, I'm like, oh, I really, so I had an image in mind. I'm like, what's going to happen with these 5 older queer men and these kids? And those kids were remarkable. And, I in my own work, when I started working when I was interning at Trinity Church, I was invited to work with the youth, and the first thing that came out of my mouth was, "Oh, I don't like teenagers." Like, it just. And what I found was that particularly the males in the group, we talk about being touch starved sometimes. They were starved to have a place where they could express who they were and feel safe and feel like they don't have to, Skip talked about it earlier, they don't have to perform. And I think it's up to us to create those spaces in our churches, in our institutions, but I think there's, not that you have to be an expert or there's probably a certain amount of training that you ask the right questions to get a response. And I think you do get a response that Karamo got on the beach. Like, he was just like, he was really intentional. He took them out of their normal space, put them in this took them to this other space that kind of allowed them to just drop all of those masks that all of us, every single one of us learn to wear, you know, and the older we get, the harder the masks are to come down. And I was actually so surprised because, you know, these are also people who are on camera, and that it was by far the most intense emotional part of that show, and it was not performative. And I think it surprised them, the young men themselves, that, oh crap, this is coming out. So I think it's incumbent upon us to be the people that help provide those spaces. And I think particularly male spaces, because I do think male loneliness leads to, I don't know if it's too big of a statement, male loneliness leads to all the violence in the world. And so it is a national health crisis in that way.
Yeah. So, I mean,
and Wesley, while you were, making those statements, and I was rethinking the episode, I saw so many of my students in those students as they were having that conversation. John, when you ask about barriers, I think, the one of the largest barriers in this conversation is that as a society, we don't allow men to express emotion. When you look at little boys who are crying, their moms and dads will tell them, don't you cry, stop crying. And that is a very early lesson, I think, to boys and to young men, that they can't express their emotion. And so when I saw those young men in that circle saying that they had not cried before, that, they had not shared many of the difficult things that were going on in their lives to anyone, I think it really starts in our childhood. And I think conversations like this are helpful in getting adults to understand what they were taught, but also to know and learn a better way to do it, so that the young people that they have influence over can take a different path, particularly when it comes to wellness and taking care of themselves and taking care of one another. And so I think that's one of the biggest barriers is we oftentimes teach boys that they can't express emotion, that they can't have these conversations, that they have to perform, they have to be a certain way. And in that circle, you saw the young man who was the happy one, and that was his job. Everybody always described him as smiling and joyful and bringing the room up when he came in, but he was dealing with all of this stuff that was outside of his role as the happy guy, that he couldn't tell anybody because he was the happy guy. So I just think that, when we talk about barriers, those are some of the big ones, in my opinion.
yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was very interested in what you were observing in a college campus setting, which this episode was contextualized in, right? So, and for me, being struck by that comment that the one young man who said, I don't even know what I'm feeling half the time. Like, even just that ability to self-identify my own emotional state and to name that, right?
John, can I just add that, like, when I heard that, I laughed out loud, not because I was trying to laugh at him, but because I know that for a good chunk of time I'm in my apartment right now, and like in my bedroom, in one of my drawers is an emotion wheel that I got from a buddy of mine, because I'm still working with my therapist to best understand my own emotions. What am I feeling? Which one is that? Just being able to identify that I think is like this continued growth for many of us. I don't want to throw everybody in that group, but I think that that's something for all of us to continue to grow. And it was just this, like, almost like spit up my drink, like, oh my gosh, okay, that's me. Like, I'm with you, man. I'm with you.
Yeah. And, Mike, you mentioned that interchange between the two, where the conversation was like, gosh, you just always look happy all the time. So, we're given these roles also in families, in groups. We take on these roles. Oh, I'm the happy one. And yet underneath, we're all carrying something. We're all carrying a sorrow, a suffering, a burden. And so for these young men to be invited to push through that, to step through that into this other space was a tremendous, just an experience for those young men that would be transformative, I would think, in terms of going forward. So I want to circle back to the Surgeon General report, because there's a quote in there where it says, from 2003 to 2020, social isolation has increased by 24 hours per month. So 24 hours per month more social isolation. This is among the population. And social engagement with friends has decreased 20 hours per month. All of this, of course, against the backdrop of perceived social connection through social media, right? So the amount of time we are experiencing isolated, increasing, the amount of time that we socially engage with friends decreasing. So Skitch, I'll come back to you. And, we know the health price that young people and society are paying for this reality. That's well documented. But what are you hearing among young people themselves in terms of what they're hungering for or wanting with respect to connection and community? And why are they finding it hard to find what they're seeking? And maybe I'm being presumptuous, maybe they're not, but what do you hear them hungering for? What are they, when they can express it, what do you hear them expressing?
Yeah, and I can definitely speak to like what I'm hearing from their voices. But then the second part of the question of like, and why? I do want to say that they're not necessarily naming all the reasons why, but I've got a few hunches that I'd like to throw out that may or may not stick. I think what I'm continuing to hear is looking for mentors, looking for guides in this, and then looking for groups of safe spaces with other male-bodied people where we can share this, or male identifying people that we can share this in a shame-free zone that we can bring down the performance and express, where we can try things on, where we can be wrong and we're not canceled. Within this space, in some sense, phones can go down, cameras can be turned off, and can I just be for a second? Instead of thinking about the next social media post that I want, especially in this culture, in the environment that Wesley or I in, and you may be having it as well, Mike, where you are, of just this like, I've got to get ahead, I've got to do this next thing for my CV, I've got to do this, I've got to do this, I've got to do that. And I can't fail at any of these. So I can't have any little hindrance to get me forward, which sharing myself may actually do that. That's too much of a risk because cancel culture is real. And so I can't try that on. So I'm just going to go one route. So I'm hearing mentors, like people that I can look to and be led by, that I can trust myself with. Again, or even a phrase that I've been using and some people have been picking up in my communities is entrust myself to. Not just trust them, but like I can kind of just allow I'm going to let their voice really speak into my life. So I think that mentor role, but then also the community. And I think some of the difficulties that I'm seeing from my perspective, there's two particularly. One, to go back to this mentor who got us to stand up and move across the room, she had written a book looking at a longitudinal study of faith formation in the US from the early 2000s into the like mid 2010s, 2012. Her name's Kendra Creasy Dean, and the book's called Almost Christian. And it was a sociological study done by Christian Smith, who's at Notre Dame. And she was then taking this sociological data and looking at it from a theological lens and what could be going on here. And it's across all religions, people that are not religious as well, being able to get this large swath of people in this longitudinal way. And why, kind of one of our big questions is, why are, church numbers decreasing? Why are people leaving high school and never coming back into the church? And what she essentially came up with was the roughest answer for any of us to experience. And it was, oh, it's because they took exactly what we gave them. We spoon fed them a really watered down religion. We didn't talk about the tough stuff. So when things got tough, they said, oh, well, the church can't hold, or this religious institution can't take my tough questions, so I'm out. And I've been thinking about that since first read it and have been in conversation with her about it, that I wonder if that's also happening here. When I read that statistic that you read of this decreased amount, 2003 to 2020, right? 17 years. 17 years ago was a long time ago. It was a very different world. And as you mentioned at the beginning of this number has been decreasing, or like there's been a change since the 70s. So things have not been getting better. So I wonder if students are looking around, young adults are looking around and going, I'm just not seeing it anywhere. Are any men having really good, deep conversations with other men? Are there things happening more than just going and getting a beer? But like, what? I'm just not seeing the depth. And so I don't know if they have felt equipped because they're not seeing it around. And so I think they're looking for mentors, but it's difficult for them to find mentors that are going to go to that next level, that are not just going to be looking at the performance CV side, but are going to look at the human side. How are you? What's going on with you? So that's, I think, one of the biggest things. Another thing that I think is needed is, again, I talked about this, like trying things on, but I think there needs to be more space to name failures, just to kind of wallow in failure and like, yep, it happened. Because I think there's this expectation, if I didn't get it right, then I'm not good, then I'm bad. Not, I didn't get it right, so I didn't do it right. Try again, like a math problem. Oh, I didn't get it right. Okay, let me just try it again. That it jumps automatically to this I'm bad, to this space of shame. And so trying to create some spaces where we can actually just come together and say, I've failed at this. Yep, I tried this, didn't work. And we can wallow in it, we can laugh with it, we can grieve with it, whatever it may need to be, but just having some spaces to do this. And there's actually a professor at Princeton University a few years ago that had actually dropped a CV of all of the things that didn't get included for all of the papers that didn't get put into academic journals, just a list of failures. And it was sent out because so often it is just the CVs of positive things. So to be able to counteract it and see how long that list was, how it was much longer than this professor's regular CV, just showed this this other side of the coin of like, this is what it means to live, is that you will fail at times. And that's okay, because that doesn't mean you're a failure. It just means you failed at this, or you tried and you get to try again. And so I think these are some spaces of like, how do we find mentors, and then how do we find some communities and spaces where we can display this other side of life? Because failure, I think, is just life.
Yeah. Mike or Wesley, anything you want to build off of on that?
Well, I think that, I agree with Skitchin that they are looking for answers. And, in my time as a young person, I probably would have been told to go figure it out. And these young people have always been given the information that they need in order to be successful, to move forward. So I think in looking for mentors, they are looking for, I agree, mentors who can provide more detail, more or deeper experiences, and not just the things that are surfacing. And I think that in many ways, when they don't get that, it frustrates them and causes them to move into that isolation because they don't feel like they're going to get what they need. On a college campus, particularly after the pandemic and the isolation of the pandemic, we found that they really wanted to be around one another because they hadn't been allowed to be around one another for 2 years. And so when regularly scheduled student activities began to open up, we had tons and tons of students who showed up who may not necessarily have shown up in the past because there had been so many things to choose from. But coming out of a time when there was nothing to choose from, when those opportunities came back, we saw students really jump on those opportunities. Now, were they present 100% all the time? No. Were they looking for that right picture to post or looking for that video to post? Yes. But they were there. And they were showing us that they had a desire to really be around one another again and have the opportunity to have some physical connection with people again.
Hmm. So Wesley, our data as well, I mean, in many studies have shown that marginalized individuals, including those from non-dominant ethnic and racial groups, as well as LGBTQ plus young people, are often at a greater risk for experiencing social disconnection and loneliness. Well documented. And I'm interested in exploring what you see as some specific ways that you seek to show up for young people who may be navigating discrimination or marginalization, often alongside disconnection and loneliness. How do we show up for them?
I say this a lot, but I live at this intersection of queer, Black, Christian. And a lot of times in those spaces, the expectation is that I leave what part of my identity do I need to leave behind to fit into this space? And I think one of the things it was fascinating that one of the things that Karamo did in the video was and my therapist does this to me all the time, even on Zoom, is Wesley, well, how are you holding your body right now? Like he talked about their body language. He talked about, and just like not being aware of our feelings sometimes, or not being able to name a feeling, like our bodies are not going to lie to us. And so, I think a lot of this discussion has been about having an embodied presence, and what our tablets and phones do is take that away from us. So, but, I recognize that, entering somewhere like, it's vital for me to bring my full self to wherever I am. So whether that means me coming to seminary like Princeton, which has not always been a queer affirming space, it's my job. Yeah, as a person who's comfortable in my sexuality, it's my job. And a seminary that's not always been an affirming place for Black students. It's my job to sit in those spaces. It's cliched maybe, but representation does matter. Seeing someone, identifying with someone who looks like you and loves like you, is absolutely important. But, also I have to, I took a class also with Kinda Dean, and one of the things that we had to do was ask pastors who pastored them. And so I found 4 pastors who I knew, working pastors, to identify and ask them, and they didn't have an answer. 3 of the 4, because they're just I'm too busy. So I can't help other people unless I'm doing the work as well. And they're in a place like Princeton, in a place like New York, in Rochester, there will be assault on my queerness and my Blackness. And so I need to be in a space where I know who I am. So someone can, that's what it took for me, is I had to see someone who looked like me. I started a group in New York, my last couple of years in New York, I was at a church, and there were a lot of queer Black men in that congregation. And I started a group called Queer Black Men in the Middle. It was Middle Church in New York. And basically, it was a safe space for queer Black men who were interested in spirituality. I'm not necessarily Christian, but most of them were. And what I found was, what a lot of us don't learn how to do as men is when we're told, "Don't you cry, boy," is we don't learn how to self-regulate because there's no one who helps us regulate, right? And so what I found in those kinds of groups is there's this co-regulation. So somebody might be out here, but as a group, and I think we've talked a bit about this, as a group, we co-regulate. And when I hear someone say, "Oh, when I came to that meeting," and I've heard kids in this youth group that I'm working with, my shoulders just relax. I'm like, okay, there's a word for that actually, and that's co-regulation. And I think that we are, man, responsible sounds like a really big word. There's a responsibility for people like in this Zoom call to be that for other people. And in order to be that for other people, I have to recognize my own struggles. I remember when I was in New York City when the pandemic started, and for 2 weeks, I was so happy. I was like, thank you, God, I can isolate legally. like I don't have to deal with people. And I got extraordinarily lonely after about 2 weeks. And I'm like, well, how, my therapist talks about being well-resourced. Am I well-resourced? And am I going to pick up those resources and use them when I need them? And I think my job as a pastor, my job as a human is to be resourced, but also to be a resource to other people.
One of the things that I would add to your question about what we can do, one of the things that we've been able to do here and that I've been able to spearhead here is a program series that we call Courageous Conversations that allows for these marginalized communities to have discussions in safe places when things are happening on campus, things are happening in the world that have significant impact on them. And so when the murder of George Floyd occurred, we had a courageous conversation around race in this country. When there were very public and violent attacks on Asian Americans, we had a conversation about what was happening there. We've had a conversation related to, how members of our LGBT plus community see themselves in this community and what they experience in this community. So I think, providing those spaces, and that kind of has been mentioned several times as we've spoken today, safe places and spaces for people to talk, to express themselves, to be seen, to be recognized and acknowledged is a real important part of some of the things that we can do to help marginalized communities with that impact of loneliness.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. And, Wesley, you mentioned the queer Black men in the middle as another model of a space like that for people. Skitch, how about for you? Models of providing safe places for young people to express vulnerability or experience a deeper sense of connection and community.
Yeah, there's been something that's happened at Princeton University for a handful of years. A friend of mine, when I was in seminary, he was a PhD student at the university, and he'd kind of been pulled into some of the leadership. And so when I transitioned out of seminary and into the Methodist chaplain on campus, he was like, "Oh, you should know about this. It's called Maverick, MAVRIC, Men's Allied Voices for a Radically Inclusive Community." And it's a space for men to come together and to have some tough conversations about what is masculinity. Not just what is toxic masculinity, let's talk about that and let's identify that, and let's see that at work in the world, but also what are healthy forms of masculinity too. And just having this space to try things on. And the way that it usually works is it's during the lunch hour. And so you can come and get free lunch, and you get free swipes into one of the dining halls on campus, and it's an hour long, and usually it's centered around one, I mean, almost like our time here, centered around an episode of something or a short article or something recently that happened in the news. And that's been continued on, led by someone who's part of the share office here. Oftentimes it's been somebody who has a background as a therapist, whether they're licensed social worker or psychologist, whatever it may be, but leading that conversation. So it's men identifying people, and that's been a beautiful thing. And there's actually one of the coaches here, the men's volleyball coach. I don't know if he mandates it, but it's almost always a room not totally full, but very well stocked with men volleyball players, which is really beautiful to see the ways in which they're engaging their own masculinity and what does it mean to be a man, and to share that with their friends who they're on a team with, but then also some other people that are there.
Yeah. Well, thank you all. I mean, there's so much in what we've been conversing here. I mean, we could go an hour on so many of these specific elements here. I'm thinking, Wesley, you got me thinking about how our body carries our sorrows, right? And how our body knows before we know in our mind the sorrows that we carry, loneliness. And so how is that embodied in us? And are there ways we can begin to identify that in our body before we can even begin to name it, and so on? Just so many aspects here that we could dive into, but our time is coming to a close here for today. So I just want to invite each one of you to offer any last practical ideas or a closing thought that you might have around this topic of how we can continue to find ways to invite young men in particular, or marginalized populations, into these kinds of conversations or spaces that are just really critical for our health and well-being. The opposite of loneliness and isolation is connection and community. I think of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who defines community as that place where I am known by name and missed if I am gone. How do we create those kinds of places for young men and marginalized persons? So any last thoughts that each one of you would want to share? And Mike, I'll start with you.
Well, one of the groups that I have an opportunity to advise is the Collegiate 100, an arm of the 100 Black men. And, their meetings are pretty traditional. You come in, you've got an agenda, you call the meeting to order and you get to business. Well, one of the things that they have started doing since they returned to campus from isolation and from the pandemic is they are now open those meetings with a wellness check. And it's a how you doing? What's going on? What's going good? What's going not so good? And it gives them in a space of 25 to 30 African-American men an opportunity to hear that not everybody is sunshine and rainbows that week. And that sometimes things are great, but sometimes folks are having challenges, academic challenges, financial challenges, emotional challenges. And they've been really open in creating a space for themselves that allows them to do that in that meeting and in that space. So if we can encourage and or create spaces for young folks to be able to do that in a way that gives them an opportunity to share and to see commonality in each other, I think that's a great step forward.
I love that. The wellness checks. Yeah. Skitch, how about for you?
I was actually going to say something very similar, Mike. I love that idea, the wellness check. What I was going to say is, the people that may be listening or watching this may be practitioners in different ways with young people or caring about young people in different ways. So they may have different programmatic elements with young people. They could look, it'd be very varied. But it doesn't have to be long. is I think what I'd say is I think there can be this assumption of I have to create this whole new program. We have to try this out and we have to get people there. Maybe it's actually just adding these little pieces, almost like from a Queer Eye perspective. One of the fun things, actually, me and my friends were talking about this morning. One of the other people on the show, who's one of the hosts, he's the food expert, Anthony, and he makes some really good food outside of the show, but in the show, sometimes I'm like, it's a little basic. But it reminds me that for some people that don't know how to do anything with food, you can't jump all the way up to filet mignon. Like you got to take some steps in between. And so maybe it's just adding some of these very practical steps of let's do a wellness check. Or in the Methodist tradition, the question that we would often ask is, how is it with your soul? How is it with your soul? And because that can open up a lot of different avenues, religious or not. And so I'd invite that, as well as if you are the practitioner leading the group, participate. Name it for yourself. As Brene Brown, I keep going back to her, as she would say, lead with vulnerability, like start it off, because you can set the tone. Or as one of the chaplains at Princeton Seminary used to say, like, vulnerability is like stepping into an elevator. You can go as deep as you want to go and get off when you want to get off. And I think that's very true. And we can model to the people that we're with, that we care about, that we can also go deep too, that we can share the things that we don't know. We can share how it is with our soul. We can do a wellness check. We can participate in these things. It's not just for them, but it's for all of us.
Yeah, I love that. I think the importance of asking those questions that can invite us into that space of vulnerability that, I think of Francisco de Osuna, 17th century mystic, who would ask the question, how is your heart today? Yeah, how is your soul? Wesley, or how about for you?
I'm going to kind of steal what Skitch said earlier in that this is not going to be perfect, right? We're going to allow for big mistakes, like the wrong thing is going to be said. Someone's going to laugh at the wrong moment. And I was thinking, I was in New York. We were doing Queer Black Men, and I was a facilitator that week. And I said, I'd like everyone to talk about their experience of their first Pride Parade. And what it ended up being was people's coming out stories. And some of it was like, there was this trauma release in the room. And I was like, uh-oh. And that's what it became, because that's what it needed to be. And I think, yes, I think it's important that we create a container, but that container just has to really be vast, and it needs to be able to go where I guess in Christian circles we'd say the spirit needs to move where the spirit needs to move, and just to be able to be flexible enough and humble enough even to let that happen, to allow that to happen without it. I can go into a meeting. Here are the things that I would like to accomplish, and which is a very male, it's a very male thing to do, and to just allow some room for what needs to happen. What I noticed that Karamo did very well was, I don't know that he knew that conversation was going to go there with these young men, and they were going to be that open, and he just allowed it and allowed them to be together in the way that they could without forcing anything. So I think that, like, almost like this dance with it is vital.
Yeah that balance of or even developing the doing mode of life and the being mode of life. We're well trained. I think, speak from my own experience, I was well trained as a young man to do, but it took me many years to learn how to be, and to be in the presence of others and be with myself, identify my own feelings, to know where they live in my body, all of that. Well, I want to thank you sincerely, each of you, Mike, Skitch, Wesley, for offering such poignant examples, for your helpful insights that have come through the work that you do every day with young people and the ways that you have sought and continue to seek to create spaces of connection and belonging for teens, for students, for young adults. We're grateful. At Springtide, we conduct sociological research to understand the lived experience of young people, but it's really only in relationship with individuals and organizations like you, who are each day out there caring deeply for these young people, that our work comes together. So grateful not only for your perspectives today, but for what you do day in and day out to promote and advance the flourishing of young people. At Springtide, our mission is to help those who care about young people to care better. And I really believe that your insights today will help many who care about young people do just that. So thank you very much. And I want to thank you, the audience that's tuning in as well. To see more of Springtide's findings, you can visit us online at springtideresearch.org, where you'll find our research reports alongside a variety of resources to help those who care about young people to care better. So thanks again, and be well.